The clock in the parlor struck once soft, deliberate, metallic, then silence. Abigail Rowe's silhouette trembled against the candlelight as she leaned toward the empty chair opposite her. "Henry," she whispered. The name rippled through the air like the last breath of a dying storm. Her maid, Clara, waiting at the doorframe, swore later she saw the fabric on the chair defies, if someone unseen had shifted their weight. By the time the clock struck 12, the flame flickered out, and Abigail collapsed. The following morning, a record appeared in the town registered at its 3 hours before her death, bearing the signature of Henry Rowe, her husband, dead since 1864. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day. And let me know where you are watching from in the comments. This isn't folklore. It's one of the most disputed events in 19th century Virginia story that threads grief, faith, and science into a single midnight whisper. Autumn, 1872. The first wind of the season moves through Albemarle County like something searching. The trees bend toward the old Rowe estate, their branches whispering against the window panes. Rain begins in hesitant strokes, then thickens into a steady percussion over sleigh roof and cracked veranda. The house stands half in shadow, white columns streaked with moss, its garden strangled by thistle and vine. From the road, it looks almost noble. Up close, it smells of mildew, iron, and the patience of something that refuses to die. Abigail Rowe lives there still. 36, dressed always in mourning black though 7 years have passed since the end of the war. The locals say she never remarried, though many asked why. Her husband, Captain Henry Rowe, Confederate officer, was last seen at Cold Harbor. No body returned, only a uniform sleeve, burned at the edge. Sealed in a box of pine and brought to her doorstep by a soldier who couldn't meet her eyes. Since that day, the estate has existed in half-light doors half shut, clocks half wound, a woman half-life her surviving letters. Now kept in the county archive, show her handwriting shrinking year by year. Each loop tighter, each word pressed deeper into paper, as if she feared her sentences might betray her. "To write is to confess," she once wrote, "and confession has no listener." Neighbors remember her as polite, lucid, but hollowed as if a portion of her lived elsewhere. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was often to inquire about things already gone. The gardener said she once asked him to prune a lilac that had been dead for 2 summers. The church ledger from 1870 lists her name only sporadically. When she did attend, she sat in the last pew, whispering into her glove during hymns. Some said she prayed. Others said she answered. The housekeeper, Mrs. Keene, stayed longer than most. She told the physician later that it began with a sound, a faint pacing in the parlor after dusk, soft, deliberate, unhurried, then the drag of a chair. A rhythmic ticking that seemed to emerge between the beats of the grandfather clock. The sound moved when one listened for it. Mrs. Keene swore she heard it behind her once, though nothing stood there but her reflection in the darkened glass. Dr. Thaddeus Grange, a physician from Charlottesville, was summoned twice that winter. His notes, preserved in the Journal of Rural Medicine, describe Abigail as in possession of her faculties, though restrained by a fixed thought. He prescribed seclusion from reminders of the departed, rest, light food, no correspondence. She nodded to every instruction, then asked if the doctor believed the dead could remember the living. He told her no. She thanked him with a smile that did not belong to gratitude. Outside, the county was rebuilding itself with borrowed hands and borrowed money. The fields of Albemarle were still scorched from the war. The men who survived spoke of loss as if it were a crop they could not stop. Plantin. In Richmond, the 1871 Journal of Medical Inquiry reported a new affliction. Auditory grief manifestations sounds heard during mourning. The article described it clinically, a perception of presence wherein the bereaved mind externalizes memory as sound. But no case matched what unfolded in the row house. Abigail began keeping a journal in February of 1872. The first pages are fragile, written in a careful, almost reverent hand. She writes of rain, the slow decay of the roof, and the quiet that breathes when no one listens. But by April the tone changes. The entries grow short, clipped, as though her thoughts were breaking into fragments. The sound returns at nightfall. One page reads, "It measures itself between the clock's ticks, as though seeking the moment that time forgets." On another, dated May 6th, the parlor chair moved again, though the fire was cold. Mrs. Keene swears it was the draft. I swear it had intent. By midsummer the housekeeper left without notice. Her letter of resignation, found decades later among estate papers, contains one sentence. There are things that walk in that house which know how to wait. After her departure, Abigail's handwriting trembles. The entries lose their margins. Some are written over earlier lines, as if she could not afford the silence of blank space. One entry records a night of thunder so violent it shook the portrait of Captain Rowe from its frame. She writes, "The glass did not shatter. It yielded, like breath on the surface of a mirror." In late August, Dr. Grange returned uninvited. The parlor smelled of oil and damp fabric. He found her seated beside the clock, eyes half closed, listening. She greeted him with a distant civility. He asked what she was listening for. She replied, "Not for him. For what remembers him." Her tone was calm, measured, the way one might speak of the weather. He later wrote that she seemed less disturbed than devoted, as though she had been apprenticed to silence. He examined her briefly, then insisted she rest. She obeyed, though. He noted her pulse quickened each time the clock struck. Before leaving, he adjusted the pendulum. "Hey," she stopped him gently, her hand pale against his sleeve. "Please don't," she said. "It doesn't like to be touched." The storm that autumn carried across Virginia with an almost biblical patience. Days of rain folded into nights of wind that rattled shutters loose. In the Rowe estate, every sound became suspect. The ticking persisted. Some nights it grew faster, as though mocking her heartbeat. Other nights it stopped entirely, only to resume when she breathed. Her journal from September is written in near-darkness ink-thinned, script frantic. It moves when I close my eyes. One line reads, "It speaks in the space between thought and word." Another, near the end of the month, "I have begun to suspect it is not him who lingers, but what he carried away with him." The final entry, dated October 3rd, breaks mid-sentence. The sound does not come from the clock, for from between its beats, then nothing. The page ends in a line that trails off into the paper's edge, as though the ink refused to follow. Dr. Grange's notes record his last visit the following night. He found Abigail half asleep by the parlor door, whispering a name he did not recognize. He wrote it down phonetically, but the record is incomplete, the ink smeared by water or tears. No genealogy in the Rowe family contains such a name. By winter, the estate was shuttered. Locals said the windows sometimes flickered with light long after midnight, though no one entered. The clock, when wound decades later by restorers, refused to keep time. Its pendulum moved, but the hands remained still, locked forever between one moment and the next. Some claimed the journal was found in a drawer of the writing desk in 1934. wrapped in black ribbon. Others say it was delivered anonymously to the Virginia Historical Archive, without explanation. Its pages, brittle yet unburned, still smell faintly of lavender and rain. The first entry greets the reader with poise. The last leaves them listening, and, somewhere in the margins, feigned as a breath, the impression of a single word written over and over, as though to remind time itself that something once lived between its beats. Charlottesville, Virginia. Winter light slants through the courthouse windows, pale and exhausted. Dust hangs in the air like suspended time. A clerk anonymous patient leans over a bound ledger whose spine cracks with age. The parchment smells of iron, mildew, and rain long dried. As the pages turn, the ink shifts in tone. Browns, grays, and one entry impossibly black. It glistens faintly even now, as if written yesterday. The name beneath the date reads with unbroken clarity, Henry Rowe. For a long moment, the clerk does not move. The surrounding names, births, deeds, disputes have all surrendered to the slow erosion of time. But this one stands defiant. The date beside it, October 17th, 1872, marks something impossible, a property transfer of 11 acres from Abigail Rowe to her husband, Captain Henry Rowe, deceased 7 years prior. The ink refuses to fade. The signature refuses to explain itself. In post-war Virginia, paperwork was chaos. Entire counties rebuilt from ash and rumor. Records of the living and the dead often shared the same column. It wasn't unusual for misdated entries, or for clerks to transcribe hearsay into law. But this was no clerical accident. Every letter in the Rowe entry bears deliberation, each curve, each downward stroke consistent with formal handwriting. Instruction of the 1860s, it is the signature of someone present, not imagined. The document became known later as the Rowe discrepancy. Dr. Edna Caldwell, University of Richmond historian, first published mention of it in 1938. Her paper, Ghosts in the Archive, Anomalies of the Reconstruction Records, notes that microchemical analysis confirmed the ink as genuine iron Gallon ink common to the period, and yet, different. Where others had browned, this remained dark, resistant to oxidation. It is, Caldwell wrote, as though it feeds on air rather than decays by it. Archivists compared the signature to known samples from Captain Rowe's military correspondence. Preserved in Confederate ledgers, the results were inconclusive. The slant was similar, but the force of line, the hesitation before the final E, was not. If forged, it was masterful. If genuine, it was inexplicable. Letters from Clara, Abigail's maid, add a personal contour to the date. One note, written in an uneven hand, describes the night of October 17th. She asked for sealing wax at 11:30, said she must send something to the captain's name so that the land may rest where it belongs. Her voice was clear, but her eyes not the same. She smiled at nothing, as though he'd just agreed. Clara never saw the document leave the house. She found the wax cooling on the desk the next morning, beside a quill still damp with ink. Abigail had not come down for breakfast. The fire in the study had burned through the night. Its smoke left the faint scent of cedar and oil, a mixture Clara said reminded her of old letters and men's coats. What happened in those hours remains conjecture. Historians later called it grief, transposed into action, the mind seeking reconciliation through ritual. Modern psychology names it bereavement-induced automatism, a state where consciousness divides, one half living, one half writing the past back into existence. But handwriting tells a deeper story. In 1952, a Smithsonian study examined the deed under magnification. The analysis revealed something unusual. 2 writing angles layered upon one another. The first a rightward slant, typical of Abigail Rowe's journals. The second sharper, descending left, consistent with her husband's surviving signatures. The strokes converge, as though written by two hands that refuse to take turns. Forensic examiners described it as dual motion overlap, but in less clinical terms, it looked like dialogue, two signatures folding into one. The more they magnified, the more distinct both angles became. One ink, the report concludes. Two directions. The ledger itself bears subtle scars. The parchment ripples slightly beneath the Rowe entry, as if pressed twice while still wet. To the touch, it feels waxy, almost resistant. A residue of something organic clings to the fibers, perhaps oil, perhaps sweat. No clerk of the period recalled processing the document. No witness signature exists. Yet the county seal appears, faintly impressed, as if from the weight of an unseen hand. The paper's survival borders on miraculous, stored for decades in the basement of the Albemarle courthouse. It was rediscovered only after a flood in 1927 forced the removal of decaying records. The Rowe page, though submerged, suffered no ink loss. When dried, its black lines re-emerged, sharper than before, like something that refused drowning. Caldwell later wrote, "Through every attempt to explain, one question persisted. Why would Abigail transfer land to a man declared dead? Some suggested symbolic closure, gesture of surrender. Others suspected superstition, that she feared his spirit remained bound to property unsettled in his name. A few whispered that she had seen him, that October night, standing in the doorway between lightning flashes. The language of grief in that era allowed such ambiguities. The living conversed with the dead not through seances, but through signatures, mementos, repeated rituals of documentation. In mourning culture, paper was a bridge, ink, a kind of sacrament. Yet something about the Rowe deed resists allegory. The tone of its writing precise, unhurried, lacks the trembling seen in Abigail's later journals. It suggests not desperation, but completion. If she wrote it alone, it was the calmest act of madness ever recorded. In 1974, a second analysis employed ultraviolet scanning. Beneath the visible ink, faint graphite indentations were found on the reverse page, words written, then pressed away. They formed three clear impressions. Meet me tonight. No one knows whether these words were part of a draft, a message, or an echo from another document pressed against it. The graphite matched 19th century composition, consistent with writing pencils used in domestic settings. The handwriting, though faint, leans rightward, Bagel style. To historians, this discovery blurred the line between correspondence and invocation. It was as if the registry itself became an altar, a place where the bureaucratic act of property exchange became a plea to the invisible. Meet me tonight. Dr. Caldwell, upon re-examining the deed in her later years, confessed that she no longer viewed it as a forgery. The ink, she wrote in her private notes, seems less applied than revealed, like something coaxed from beneath the page. Within grief studies, the Rowe case became a landmark example of post-war psychogenic phenomena. But beyond the academic language, the image remains haunting. A widow, alone in her study, by lamplight, drawing two names into one document. Outside, the autumn wind shaking the shutters. The clock ticking unevenly. Perhaps the sound between its beats, the one she once feared, now guiding her hand. The clerk who rediscovered the ledger in 1938 recorded his impressions in the margin of the copy. His handwriting is neat, measured. The signature moves faintly when light passes across it. Perhaps moisture in the ink, or perhaps something else. The document was sealed again in 1955 for preservation. It rests today in the Virginia State Archive, boxed in linen, kept at constant humidity. Visitors described the same thing, a faint scent of cedar, as though the ink still remembers the night it was written, and there, under glass, the signature remains black, fluid, impossibly recent. The name of a man who died at Cold Harbor, written 11 years after his disappearance. on a night when a widow called for sealing wax and spoke to the air as though it could listen. The page ends with legal finality, transfer complete, yet on the reverse, in graphite, almost invisible. Those 3 words still wait, pressed deep enough to outlast a century. Meet me tonight. Late winter, 1873. The Rowe parlor sits under a crust of frost, its windows fogged from within, its curtains drawn tight against the night. Candlelight trembles in glass, reflected across mahogany and velvet like a nervous pulse. Dr. Thaddeus Grange sits at a small writing table, his inkpot haloed by the flicker of flame. Across from him, Abigail Rowe waits in her chair by the hearth, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The fire is dying, her face illuminated in alternating flashes of orange and shadow seams, carved from stillness itself. What began as compassion has become observation. Grange no longer visits out of duty, but out of curiosity sharpened into study. His journal, later found among his estate papers dated 1901, begins plainly. At precisely 11:57 p.m., Mrs. Rowe ceases all speech. A pressure fills the air. My instruments do mercury thermometers, and a hanging compass respond, as if the room itself exhales. Outside, Albemarle County lies quiet, asleep beneath snow and soot. Inside, time feels hesitant, reluctant to continue its forward march. On the mantel, the great parlor clock looms its pendulum sweeping, steady arcs that echo against the walls. Yet beneath that rhythm, a second pulse seems to stir, something quieter, almost human in cadence. The doctor's notes detail his procedure. He places one thermometer near the hearth, another by the window. A compass dangles from fine thread. Each night he measures, records, and waits. At midnight, the readings fluctuate. A 6-degree drop, then silence. The compass trembles eastward, then west. The clock, as if obeying some unseen signal, stops. Not a falter, a decision. Abigail never seems to notice. Her breathing continues, slow and measured, as though she hears another tempo. On March 3rd, Grange writes, the clock ceased at 11:59. Mrs. Rowe's lips moved, though no sound emerged. The air thickened. The light in the candles narrowed to a single blue line. When sound returned, the clock resumed, as though time had only paused to listen. He does not believe in spirits. He writes this often, as if to reassure himself. Yet something in the atmosphere of that house begins to press against reason. He describes the air as tactile, an invisible weight shifting from corner to corner. Some nights, the temperature dips so low, his breath fogs in front of him, though the hearth burns steady. To explain the phenomena, Grange looks outward to science, to precedent. Across the nation, the post-war years had bred a hunger for contact with the unseen. In parlors from Boston to New Orleans, the newly bereaved gathered around tables, tapping, rapping, spelling out alphabets to absent sons. The Society for Psychical Advancement, founded in Boston in 1872, catalogued over 300 such cases, widows claiming telegraphic communion with the lost. The language of grief became mechanical. The dead were not gone. They were simply unresponsive. But what happened in the Rowe parlor differed from St. There were no mediums, no alphabets, no table knocks. Only one woman, and a clock that refused to obey the hours assigned to it. By the 6th session, Grange notes a pattern. The clock stops once each night between 11:59 and 12 o'clock. Never early, never late. The precision is unnatural, he writes, as though something waits for consent before it moves. On March 12th, his entry changes tone. The handwriting tightens, slants downward, urgency beneath restraint. The pause in time is audible. We all hear it. His assistant, a young man named Lyle, corroborates the account in later testimony. He describes a moment where all sound withdrew: the fire, the wind, the heartbeat. It was, he said, like the world took one breath too deep and forgot to exhale. Grange attempts rationalization. He calls it a nervous echo, an atmospheric anomaly triggered by Abigail's presence, a protest of the nervous system against absence. He concludes a phrase later cited by physicians studying traumatic grief, but his own logic falters when the assistant discovers the clock's escapement mechanism, its very heart missing. It had been removed days before the first session. The clock should not have moved at all. When confronted, Abigail only smiled faintly. "Time obeys who listens," she said, her voice soft, almost kind. After that, her demeanor shifted. She began speaking less to the living and more to the chair opposite hers. Some nights, she whispered names the doctor did not record at first. Then he began to write them down: Nathaniel, Amos, Henry. Each name spoken as if recalling a forgotten prayer. On the 8th night, her voice took on rhythm, murmuring beneath the sound of the wind. The doctor noted her pupils dilated, her pulse steady. "She is neither possessed nor hysterical," he wrote, "but engaged as one might be when listening to a familiar song played from another room." Lyle, unnerved, begged him to end the sessions. Grange refused. "History will remember this house," he said. "Let it remember us as witnesses." By the 9th night, the weather had turned. Rain beat against the shutters with dull persistence. The house groaned beneath its age. Inside, the candles trembled low, each flame bowing as if in deference to something unseen. The instruments were set as usual: thermometers, compass, clock. At 11:57, Abigail went silent. Her hands, resting on the table, tightened slightly. Grange observed a faint vibration through the floorboards, as if distant footsteps approached. The compass needle spun twice, stopped, and pointed north. The thermometers dropped in unison. He leaned forward, whispering her name. She didn't answer. Her lips moved slowly, deliberate. He heard her whisper, "He's almost through." Then the clock began to tick backward. At first it was subtle, a stutter, in rhythm. Then the motion reversed fully, each second unwinding the last. The sound deepened, hollow, as if echoing from inside the walls. The pendulum's arc grew sharper, its metal gleam pulsing like a heartbeat caught in reverse. Grange's notes from that night are smeared with ink and water damage. But one line remains legible: the mechanism is absent, yet the sound continues. "I feel the room pulling inward." Lyle fled before midnight. He later told investigators that the air in the parlor folded, that the shadows of the furniture bent toward Abigail, as though drawn to her voice. Grange remained seated, hand gripping his pen, recording until the ink froze mid-stroke. At 12:04, silence. The clock stopped. The temperature normalized. Abigail exhaled and opened her eyes. She appeared calm, even relieved. "He's almost through," she repeated softly, as though completing a conversation unheard by others. Afterward, Grange would never again set foot in the Rowe estate. His later writings attempt distance, but fragments of belief slip through the cracks of reason. In one unsent letter to a colleague, he confesses, "I am no longer certain that perception begins with the living. Perhaps it is borrowed, shared between those who wait and those who remember." When the housekeeper returned weeks later, she found the parlor undisturbed except for the clock. It sat perfectly upright, pendulum still, but the hands remained fixed at midnight, their metal faintly warm to the touch. The journals of Dr. Grange end abruptly that same spring. The final entry reads, "Absence leaves an echo that learns to speak." Beneath it, a small sketch of a clock face, sits numerals reversed. Historians now refer to these events as the parlor experiments. Some frame them as manifestations of grief, others as early psychical research preceding the American spiritualist movement's formalization, but no replication has ever matched the phenomena. When the house was finally dismantled in 1911, the clock was recovered, stored briefly in the courthouse before vanishing from record. Only one photograph remains, a blurred image showing the faint reflection of a woman's silhouette on its glass. Though no one stood near the camera, in every surviving account, one detail persists. The clock's face, even in stillness, appears caught mid-motion, its second hand poised, not between ticks, but between directions, as though time itself could not decide which way to go. And somewhere between those seconds, the faint impression of a whisper, too soft for certainty, but preserved in the memory of every witness who lived long enough to tell it. He's almost through. The first noise is almost indistinguishable from wind, a low static hiss, followed by what experts later describe as a pulse-steady, deliberate human. The phonograph cylinder that carries it was found in 1928, buried beneath a pile of coal dust and moth-eaten curtains in the Rowe cellar. When played, it emits not melody, but breath. Beneath the static, a woman's voice repeats two words with aching persistence. Not gone, not gone. The tone never rises above a whisper, yet something in its rhythm presses against the listener. As if the silence itself resists conclusion, the discovery startled even the archivists. By 1873, phonographs were nearly mythical in Virginia's scientific curiosities glimpsed only in exhibitions or by wealthy collectors. But one record in the Smithsonian's forgotten correspondence confirmed an unlikely visitor, a field researcher named Lucien Capel. His surviving notes speak of his journey through Albemarle County that winter, where he claimed to have encountered a widow who recorded silence that spoke. Historians dismissed it as poetic exaggeration until the cylindry appeared. The voice within it matched the documented cadence of early acoustic impressions, primitive, mechanical, and hauntingly intimate. Reconstructing it took months. In 1979, FBI audio analysts ran spectrographic comparisons, isolating frequencies within the recording. They found intervals repeating at a near-perfect rate of 60 beats per minute, identical to the measured oscillation of a pendulum clock. The anomaly wasn't random. The rhythm seemed alive, synchronized, almost breathing. The analysts noted a strange parallel. Every phrase of Not Gone aligned with a faint, metallic click, consistent with a clock's escapement striking in reverse. It was as though the voice spoke through time's machinery itself. The investigators turned to Abigail's letters for grounding, preserved by her niece and donated to the University of Virginia in 1912. The early pages are measured, almost clinical brief notes on visitors, weather, household repairs. But as spring of 1873 unfolds, her handwriting disintegrates. Sentences collapse into fragments. Grammar dissolves into repetition. Voice matches the clock, one reads. Clock is breathing. No explanation follows. The ink trails downward. As if her hand fell away mid-thought, that same period saw Lucien Capel traveling east toward Richmond. His field diary half legible, streaked with soot mentions. An experiment conducted in a drawing room of exquisite gloom. He describes the subject as calm, listening with the patience of one expecting her own name. He wrote of recording silence for 7 minutes, claiming afterward the phonograph captured something denser than quiet, as if a word were trapped within air. He died 4 years later from an unrecorded fever, and his belongings were auctioned privately. No reference to the cylinder appeared again until that cellar excavation in 1908. By the 1960s, interest in the Rowe case had shifted from curiosity to cognitive study. Dr. Evelyn March, a historian of consciousness at King's College, published a paper on temporal hallucination, the mind's ability to synchronize trauma with rhythmic sound, clocks, trains, ocean waves, repetition becomes a metronome for grief. Her hypothesis: Abigail Rowe's obsession with timekeeping was not madness, but survival instinct, her psyche encoding loss into measurable intervals. When silence answered, she mistook it for the dead, replying. March's conclusion was clinical, but her tone betrayed unease. "There are frequencies we do not hear," she wrote. "That does not mean they are unoccupied." Through March's correspondence, another unsettling detail emerged. During the last weeks of her study, she obtained permission to visit the Rowe property. The house, long abandoned, had collapsed inward. Yet beneath the debris, she found a clock face buried in silt, its hands fused at 12. The gears within were intact, but reversed. The pendulum mechanism had been reassembled backward, each swing opposing the natural pull of gravity. No craftsman could explain how it remained balanced. She left it untouched. Letters from the same period describe Abigail's descent into isolation. Servants reported she began locking the parlor from within, refusing to leave until morning. She slept beside the clock, wrapped in her husband's uniform coat. Neighbors claimed the curtains never moved, the air heavy as if sealed. Clara Her, maid of 9 years, resigned in June 1873, leaving behind one unsigned statement. The house no longer breathes the same air. Weeks later, children walking home from church saw a light moving behind the parlor's draped steady, golden, like a lantern swinging in rhythm. Yet no one had entered the house for days. When men from the township forced open the front door, they found the air warm, though the hearth was cold. The clock on the mantel ticked backward, its pendulum motionless. Archival accounts vary on what they saw next. Some speak of a faint glow emanating from the phonograph, others insist it was the reflection of candlelight from the window. But all agree the cylinder remained on the table, spinning long after the mechanism had stopped. It rotated silently, a motion detached from physics, and somewhere inside that motion, faint as memory, the voice returned, not gone. For decades, the recording was treated as hoax, its authenticity impossible to verify. Yet the acoustic signature anonymous, unrepeatable, defied simple explanation. When the FBI transferred it to magnetic tape for preservation, the technician assigned to the case filed an unofficial note. Pattern persists during playback even when cylinder removed. Frequency reappears in room tone. The implication disturbed even the skeptics. The sound wasn't inside the medium. It was inside the air. Over time, the story faded into folklore, a cautionary footnote in the annals of American spiritualism. But every few years, someone returns to the Rowe case. Each time, new technology strips another layer from the static. And beneath it, the same fragile insistence emerges, not gone. The words seem to fold around their own echo, drawing breath from silence itself. In 2003, a private collector submitted a digital remaster of the original cylinder to the National Audio Archive. The waveform revealed a faint secondary track, deeper than the voice-o-mechanical oscillation, precisely matching the pendulum frequency of the clock recovered from the ruins. That alignment, exact to the millisecond, suggested synchronization far beyond the limits of 19th century equipment. When analysts compared it to heartbeat patterns, they found a near-perfect human correlation, 60 beats per minute. The findings reignited debate among historians and physicists alike. Some proposed electromagnetic interference, others deliberate fabrication. But none could explain the persistence of that rhythm appearing even in recordings made decades later within the same room. Whatever energy had been captured seemed inseparable from place itself, like a pulse impressed into atmosphere, Abigail's final recorded note, dated July 1st, 1873, offers no closure. He keeps time when I cannot. The handwriting is steadier than previous entries, almost serene. Beneath it, an uncharacteristic signature. Simply no further documents follow. Her death record lists cause unknown. The house passed quietly through relatives, then to neglect, standing in that parlor. Today, with its collapsed beams and silent clock, it is difficult to separate science from sorrow. Perhaps the phonograph caught no spirit, only the tremor of a mind trying to map love onto time. Yet the sound endures, its phrase unwavering, not gone. It speaks not only from the cylinder, but from every space where memory refuses to fade, every silence that holds the shape of a name once spoken. 3 weeks after the last letter, neighbors reported one final disturbance. The parlor door, long jammed shut, opened itself before midnight. A thin beam of light spilled into the hallway, steady and pale. Then the door closed again slowly, deliberately as though answering someone unseen. No one entered after that night, but those who stood outside swear they heard the faintest echo, rhythmic and patient, counting backward through the hours that no longer belonged to time. Midnight split the horizon in a single white fracture. Rain hammered the clay roads of Albemarle County, and lightning brief, surgical at the windows of the long-abandoned Rowe estate. In Charlottesville, 15 miles away, a telegraph operator named Charles Lyman sat alone at his post, listening to the soft chatter of distant relays when a broken signal cut across the line. 3 short bursts, one long, then silence. The transcription log captured only fragments before the current failed. Name spoken clock. The system registered origin from the Rowe estate line, but no telegraph device was ever documented. There, no wires, no station, only the coordinates 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 42 seconds p.m. October 3rd, 1873. A moment preserved in the Virginia State Utility Ledger, Series V73, page 214. The record still exists. An unexplained call that lasted 6 seconds, outside Charlottesville. The storm rolled inland. Witness accounts would later piece together a strange coherence between lightning and time, each flash marking the same interval, the same rhythm. One witness, Mrs. Harlow, claims she woke when the church bell rang once, clear and metallic, though the bell itself had been removed for repair 2 weeks earlier. She described the tone as heavy, like metal dragged through water. By dawn, the rain had stopped. At the Rowe property, fog rose from the orchard and drifted toward the parlor windows. Inside, the air smelled of burnt ozone and damp fabric. Abigail was found seated upright beside the clock, her pulse weak but steady, eyes open yet unfocused. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers curled around a folded page. The ink had bled from the moisture, but one line was still legible. When the clock stops, memory returns. No one knew who found her first. Dr. Grange's name appears on the coroner's statement, but his later note suggests hesitation. He wrote, "The body exhibited faint muscular tension consistent with recent auditory startle." The clock beside her ceased motion at 11 hours 59 minutes and 58 seconds, 2 seconds before midnight. Those who entered the parlor reported a sensation, an atmospheric pressure that seemed to hold their breath inside their chests. The clock's glass face was intact, yet the hands pressed slightly backward, as if resisting the next tick. By morning, word spread through town. Some said the Rowe line had sent the telegraph message not by machine but through interference. Current carried along ground moisture, animating the old wires like veins. Others proposed a simpler cause: lightning, static discharge, misread codes. But none explained this single-word clock, nor why the bell had sounded. In the following weeks, rumors multiplied. Farmers swore their livestock froze each night at the stroke of 12. One claimed his pocket watch reversed for 2 beats before continuing. Small disturbances, never violent, but precise, always at the same minute. Decades later, researchers would call it the 12 o'clock anomaly. They traced it through logs, diaries, and residual magnetometer readings taken long after the house was empty. Each pointed to a single frequency: 486 Hertz, the resonant tone of the Rowe parlor's wood panels when struck by wind. In 2011, a research team at the University of Charlottesville recreated the room. Same dimensions, same cedar density, same brass casing and barometric conditions recorded that night. They placed a pendulum clock at the center and broadcast a steady whisper at 486 hertz. The sound wove through the chamber like vapor, amplifying until it became indistinguishable from breath. Instruments picked up faint synchronization between the audio wave and the pendulum's motion. For 1 minute, the system achieved perfect rhythm between human whisper and mechanical swing. Then, at the 58th second, all motion ceased. Every trial, identical result: termination at 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 58 seconds. No mechanical failure. No programming error. The digital logs froze. Even the time stamp halted for precisely 2 seconds before resuming. The anomaly repeated itself under every condition, with new equipment, even at different locations. Something in the harmonic structure of that number, its physical correspondence to the Rowe parlor's dimensions, seemed to invite interruption. A pattern of stillness written into air itself. Archival letters from Dr. Grange, rediscovered in 1974, reveal he had begun hearing faint rhythmic distortions long before the telegraph incident. He wrote to a colleague in Richmond, "I now believe the woman's malady is not her own but environmental a resonance of absence seeking equilibrium." His phrasing, half scientific, half confessional, hinted that he no longer separated sound from memory. Abigail's final note, found later among his papers, contained a different tone. "If he returns at 12, she wrote, I must keep him from leaving again." Her handwriting trembled between lines, as though written during motion. The telegraph message name spoken remains the most debated detail. Some believe it referred to Henry, the final name she had whispered during earlier sessions. Others suggested marked her own, uttered aloud as a signal. When modern analysts enhanced the 1873 wire transcript, they discovered an additional faint pulse before the word clocked. It matched neither human code nor electrical noise. The interval corresponded exactly to a human heartbeat. By now, the Rowe estate had become a site of quiet study. Physicists visited under pretense of structural analysis. Historians catalogued soil composition and atmospheric density. The more they measured, the more uniform the data became. Every instrument recorded subtle deceleration at midnight, then returned to normal pace. The house did not appear haunted, it appeared synchronized to absence. In the broader field of temporal cognition, the Rowe case began representing a transitional point, where personal grief becomes mechanical habit, and habit becomes temporal architecture. Trauma repeating itself until time bends around the echo. Some psychological models suggest that sustained repetitions such as the rhythmic ticking of a clock can create neurological feedback loops. embedding emotional events within sensory cues. To a grieving mind, the metronome of loss becomes a form of heartbeat, and stopping it feels like ending memory itself. But in the Rowe estate, the process reversed. The heartbeat wasn't preserved by memory, it preserved memory. The house itself had learned to remember. When the 2011 research team presented their findings, they ended with a line borrowed from Grange's journal. "We are not haunted by the dead, but by the precision of what they leave behind." That precision, even now, holds. The original clock sits in a museum basement, pendulum restored, gears cleaned, glass replaced. Visitors occasionally remark that it ticks unevenly, though tests show perfect calibration. Recordings taken overnight reveal micro-pauses in the mechanism, each occurring at the same time. 11:59:58.2 seconds of silence. Like an inhalation, and then the rhythm resumes. It is easy to dismiss this as a mechanical quirk, a myth perpetuated by those who need mystery to survive the void. Yet the data continues to insist upon itself. A telegraph call without a machine, a bell that rang without a bell, a clock that stopped without reason. The deeper pattern may not concern time at all, but attention, the way the mind latches onto repetition, fearing that if sound stops, meaning stops too. Abigail's final words, "When the clock stops, memory returns," suggest she knew this, that she sought the end of rhythm, believing silence would bring reunion. Instead, the rhythm continued, and perhaps that is the tragedy of the Rowe estate. Not that something supernatural occurred, but that grief proved stronger than physics. The human will to listen, to insist on hearing through absence, found its reflection in time itself. Even now, in acoustic reconstructions, the model of the Rowe parlor maintains that faint oscillation between motion and rest, a 2-second hesitation before the world exhale. In those 2 seconds, no machine records, no current moves. The air holds its breath. The room remembers what it once heard. And somewhere inside that pause, beyond the static, beyond the storm, beyond the endless echo of the telegraph pulse, someone still speaks the name. The ash settles like gray snow across the skeletal remains of the Rowe estate. What was once a grand Georgian manor on the edge of Albemarle now lies quiet, a silence too absolute, as if even the crows avoid speaking of what happened here. Among the cinders and twisted iron, a volunteer sifts through debris, his hands trembling from cold or something else entirely. He lifts what looks like an old envelope, its edges curled, half-burned, yet miraculously intact. The script on its surface is still legible. Mrs. Abigail Rowe, Albemarle. Inside, the parchment bears a faint scent of soot and lilac oil, traces of a life abruptly interrupted. The ink, though faded, holds steady against time's erosion. It's dated February 17, 1875, just 18 days before the fire that consumed everything. The message is brief, only a single line followed by initials. "Do not answer when it calls." Signed, simply, HR. For decades, that letter sat in the county archive, sealed inside a glass case, marked "recovered from the Rowe fire." March 7, 1875. The Charlottesville Gazette had recorded the disaster in careful detachment. Main residence destroyed. No identifiable source of ignition, but the details that survived beyond print were stranger. No trace of Abigail Rowe was found, only her wedding ring, fused to the melted brass of the clock's pendulum. The clock had once hung in the hallway facing the east windows. Visitors said you could hear its chime before you saw it, a thin metallic echo that filled the house like breath. When the fire ended, and the embers cooled, rescuers pulled it from the ruins, scorched, cracked, yet whole. When it was set on a wooden table for inspection, the pendulum began to move again. No winding, no mechanism reset. It simply began to tick, By 1920, the letter resurfaced in public curiosity when County Archivist Lyle Monroe authenticated the paper stock and ink as true to the 1870s. His marginal note in the report carried a tone between admiration and unease. "If a forgery, it is the cleverest I've seen." He died 2 years later. His colleagues found the original note still on his desk, a faint scorch mark along the bottom edge. But the story didn't end with the letter's discovery. Among Abigail's belongings, those few not claimed by Flame, was a small journal, water-stained and incomplete. Its final pages reconstructed through fragments held in different collections across Virginia. Together, they painted a portrait of a woman caught between faith and dread. Her handwriting grew uneven toward the end, the language increasingly circular, as though she were writing not for record, but as an act of containment. One line stood out, repeated twice, each time with slightly altered phrasing. "It doesn't speak from beyond, it speaks from before." Scholars have argued over what she meant. Some interpret it as delusion born of isolation. Others believe she sensed something in echo, a pattern of time bending back upon itself. The Rowe family estate had long been rumored to sit atop an older foundation, one belonging to a structure burned in 1811. Local oral histories mention a similar event, nearly identical in detail: an unexplained fire, the disappearance of a woman, the survival of a clock. If the parallels are coincidence, they are precise ones. The diary entries in the final week mention strange sounds, a low hum beneath the floorboards, a whisper that rose with the wind but came from within the walls. Abigail described hearing her name when no one was near. "Not a voice," she wrote, "but a pressure in the air, shaping the syllables of her name without breath. When it calls," she noted, "the flame brightens, even with no fire near." The letter's warning, "Do not answer when it calls," takes on a new gravity against that backdrop. It was addressed not to warn her of an external threat, but to prevent her from acknowledging something already within her perception. The identity of H.R. remains unresolved. No relative or acquaintance by those initials appears in Rowe's correspondence or social registry. Some researchers have speculated it could stand for Henry Rowe, her husband, though records show he died 5 years prior, in 1870. The fire itself remains an anomaly. The estate's servants, sleeping in the carriage house, reported waking to a blue light through the windows. "Not flame," one said, but the color of lightning held still. By the time they reached the main doors, the house was already engulfed. No smoke at first, only heat and sound, a rushing roar like wind through stone, and then silence. When investigators returned in daylight, they found the parlor floorboards charred in a perfect circle, the clock resting at its center. The clockmaker's signature was barely visible on the inner plate: H. Rowe, 1870, the same initials as on the letter. Whether Abigail saw the warning as omen or invitation, no one knows, but her diary's tone shifts after February 17th. The entries become abstract, reflective, as if she were corresponding with her own future. "I think I am remembering what has not yet happened," she wrote. "When the air thickens, the hour feels familiar." In her last surviving page, dated March 6th, night before the fire, she describes sitting before the clock at midnight. "It spoke without sound," she wrote, "not to my ears, but to my thought. I answered, and the air broke." The next day, the house was gone. Lyle Monroe's later analysis found that the letter's ink, when tested under certain solutions, produced faint traces of iron oxide commonly used in clock mechanisms, not writing ink. That detail was buried in an internal note, never published. Monroe's assistant, decades later, recalled that he once muttered, "The letter wasn't written, it was etched." The clock itself vanished sometime in the 1940s, last seen in a private collection in Richmond, its ownership untraceable. But in 1972, a local family near Albemarle reported hearing rhythmic ticking in their cellar each Night at 3:07 a.m., the recorded time of the Rowe fire. They found nothing when they searched, only a faint circular burn mark on the concrete floor. Historians interpret the Rowe tragedy as a convergence of superstition and misfortune. Yet the artifacts resist such simplicity. The diary's handwriting interrupted the clock's impossible resumption. The warning that arrived before the event it foretold. Do not answer when it calls. The phrase echoes not as command, but as paradoxian awareness of something that moves through memory like light through smoke. Abigail Rowe might not have been haunted by the past at all. She may have been haunted by what was still to come. Every generation retells her story as metaphor, fire as punishment, time as witness, silence as protection. But the letter's endurance suggests another reading, that some messages are sent not forward or backward, but through the line between cause and consequence blurred by the act of perception itself. The ashes of the Rowe estate remain undisturbed now, fenced off behind state markers and overgrown with ivy. Locals say that on still nights, when the air holds its breath, you can hear the faint ticking beneath the soil. Not mechanical, not rhythmic, more like a heartbeat slowed by time. In the county archive, the letter rests in a sealed case, dimly lit under filtered glass. The paper has grown brittle, its edges darkened by decades of exposure. Yet the ink endures, still visible, still legible, still warning, do not answer when it calls. And every archivist who has ever read it swears they hear something faint between the seconds as they turn away. The sound of the clock, the sound of time, remembering itself, the sound of something that never stopped burning. Richmond, Virginia, autumn of 1911. The city hums with the quiet confidence of a nation entering modernity. Electric lamps glowing in storefronts, horse-drawn carriages sharing roads with the first motor. In a narrow brick building on East Main Street, a man named Frederick Gable unlocks his antique shop before sunrise. Dust swirls in the air as he turns the brass key, unaware that inside the store, something has already begun to move. On the far wall, behind a row of porcelain clocks and nautical instruments, stands a timepiece unlike any other, a tall walnut case. Its surface scorched faintly black around the dial, as if it once survived flame. The brass pendulum swings in perfect rhythm, but every hour, without fail, it skips the final beat, then begins again. The invoice lists it plainly. One long case clock. Origin: Albemarle County Estate Fire, 1875. No one in Richmond remembers the Rowe family now. But the fire is still whispered about in rural archives, a tragedy without explanation, a home consumed from within. Gable bought the clock at a rural auction, impressed by its craftsmanship. But soon after it arrived, customers began to notice something strange. It hesitates, one man said, like it's listening before deciding to continue. For weeks, the clock remained a curiosity, a relic that gave the shop a faint air of haunted prestige. Then came October. Annie Brim, Gable's young assistant, was the first to see it happen. She stayed late one night to finish the inventory. Around midnight, she heard a soft worry from the back room, the subtle rearranging of gears. When she turned, the hands of the Rowe clock were moving backward, slowly, precisely, 1 minute of reversed time. Then, as if satisfied, the clock resumed its normal course. Annie thought fatigue had tricked her senses, yet the event repeated exactly 1 year later, same month, same night, same duration. She began keeping notes, sketching diagrams by lamplight. Each October, she wrote, it unthreads 60 seconds from itself. By the 1940s, Annie's record surfaced in the Journal of Anomalous Mechanics. Her drawings, meticulous, almost obsessive, showed the escapement mechanism perfectly intact. There was no visible reason for reversal. One engineer called it an impossible self-correction. Another suggested it was responding to an external magnetic oscillation, though none was found. Annie's final entry in 1931 reads simply, It remembers something that hasn't yet happened again. She died that winter. The clock still ticking in the shop corner. Decades passed. Ownership of the store changed hands. The clock, like an unwanted witness, followed each new proprietor until, in 1952, it was sold privately to a collector in Baltimore. Records show a brief restoration attempt, polishing, alignment, gear calibration, but the craftsman who opened its casing resigned midway, claiming the mechanism feels wrong, as though resisting interference. By the late 20th century, the clock had traveled again, this time to Washington, D.C., donated to a small historical foundation. Among its exhibits, it might have faded into obscurity, if not for a woman named Ellen Rowe. Ellen, a linguist at the University of Virginia, visited the foundation in 1984 after tracing her lineage back to the lost Rowe estate of Alabama. When she first heard the clock's uneven cadence, she froze. The sound, soft skipping, almost breathing, reminded her of an old wax cylinder she had studied in graduate school. It contained the faint voice of her great-grandmother, Abigail Rowe, preserved in 1928 by a neighbor experimenting with early sound recording. The whisper on the cylinder was almost unintelligible, a murmured fragment thought to say her own name, Abigail. Ellen requested permission to compare the audio spectrogram of the whisper to the clock's pendulum rhythm. Using analog equipment, she mapped the oscillation frequencies. The resemblance was unnerving. The same rhythmic signature, the same rising inflection at each third beat. It was as if the clock were articulating, in mechanical language, the memory of a human breath. Years later, in 1998, NASA Langley's Acoustic Research Division conducted a more advanced analysis. Using high-resolution time-frequency mapping, they discovered that the pendulum's oscillations formed a repeating phonetic cadence. The result, rendered as waveform data, spelled something uncanny, the spectral equivalent of the word Abigail. The researchers dismissed it as coincidence of harmonic resonance. But one note in the lab's appendix read, "Pattern appears intentional," suggests symbolic encoding, though no mechanism for such behavior exists. The clock's file was quietly archived. Still, the pattern persisted. Technicians reported hearing faint clicks beyond mechanical timing, teeny pauses that followed the rhythm of human speech. A guard once claimed that, when he stood close to the clock after midnight, he could feel pressure in the air, like someone inhaling behind the glass. He refused to lock the exhibit again. Ellen returned in 1999 for what she called a final observation. The foundation had planned to loan the clock to a museum in North Carolina. That October, she arranged to record one last data sequence. On the evening of October 17th, at exactly 11:59 p.m., she began the session. The device clicked on, microphones calibrated. The pendulum swung with its usual gray-stick pause, tick until the top of the hour. Then silence. Both hands froze at 12 o'clock. The tick ceased. The air itself seemed suspended. For one full minute, time inside the room stopped. Clocks on the walls continued, but the Rowe clock refused motion. Ellen's equipment recorded nothing, no sound, no vibration, not even ambient hum. The digital waveform flatlined. At 12:01, without warning, the pendulum began again. The sound burst back through the microphone in a single, violent tick that cracked the audio level. Both hands remained fused at 12 o'clock, as though marking a boundary neither side could cross. Between days, between seconds, Ellen's field notes that night were brief. It doesn't tell time anymore. It holds it. Later testing confirmed that the mechanical system had suffered no damage. The mainspring remained intact, the escapement untouched. And yet, since that night, the clock has refused to advance beyond midnight. Winding it changes nothing. It ticks, but it never moves. When NASA analysts revisited Elon's recording, they found something she hadn't noticed. Buried beneath the static, just before the silence began, was a single low-frequency pattern too soft for human hearing, but visible in spectral form. Its curve matched the waveform of Abigail Rowe's whisper from the 1928 cylinder. If coincidence? It is the most precise one in recorded acoustics today. The Rowe clock remains sealed in climate-controlled storage in Richmond, its dial permanently set to 12. Visitors report faint ticking through the glass. Some swear they can hear 2 ticks at once. One forward, one backward, like an argument between past and present. For historians, it stands as artifact, a relic of craftsmanship, tragedy, and folklore. For physicists, it is an unsolved anomaly, a closed system that defies temporal symmetry. But for those who know the Rowe story, the fire, the letter, the warning, it feels like something else entirely. Perhaps the clock does not measure time as we do. Perhaps it measures memory, a pendulum of repetition, swinging through the boundary of what once was and what refuses to end. Abigail's final diary line read, "When the air breaks, time folds," a phrase scholars once dismissed as madness. Yet, in the rhythmic defiance of that clock, its refusal to move past the hour of midnight, there lingers the same suggestion that not all moments end when we believe they do. Some remain suspended, echoing forward, waiting to be heard, and every October, when midnight nears, the curators of the foundation swear the ticking slows fraction by fraction until the second hand almost stops, not broken, listening, as though expecting someone, somewhere, to answer. Then, with a single hesitant click, it begins again. Tick, pause, tick, and the sound, if you listen closely, still forms the shape of a name. Washington, D.C., 2021. In the basement of the Smithsonian's Audio Preservation Division, a faint hum fills the air servers working through centuries of recorded sound. Among the reels, cylinders, and magnetic tapes lies a wax cylinder marked in pencil, Rowe, 1873. The artifact has passed through dozens of hands, analyzed, catalogued, and forgotten. Until now, the technicians feed the fragile cylinder into a digitization cradle. Laser scanners trace its grooves with submicron precision, converting each vibration into numerical data. At first, the sound is unremarkable crackling static, faint murmurs of human breath, the same audio studied for nearly a century. But beneath that noise, in the inaudible spectrum below 20 Hz, the system detects something new, a resonance, 3 seconds long. It is not random. Its waveform displays periodic symmetry too deliberate for mechanical error. When amplified and converted to audible range, it forms a low, quivering pattern, like a breath through glass. The team pauses. One technician isolates the subharmonic signature and enhances it with a rise spectral reconstruction. The processed output yields a single word, shaped in the rhythm of a whisper. Henry? The room goes still. To most, it's just a name. But the metadata ties the cylinder to Albemarle County, Virginia, the same location as the Rowe estate. Fire of 1875. The same family whose heirloom clock still defies natural explanation. Voice print analysis confirms a near-human timbre, feminine, roughly mid-30s. Linguistic AI models trained on the phonetics of the late 19th century classify it as regionally accurate for Virginia English of the AI 1870s. But the final finding is what unsettles everyone. The whisper's spectral shape may chas a synthesized genetic voice print derived from modern descendants of the Rowe lineage, 98.2% correlation. One of the researchers, Dr. Elena Cruz, writes in her preliminary notes, "The waveform behaves as though the speaker is biologically related to the listener, despite a century's separation." The data spreads through academic circles like wildfire. Within months, the Journal of Temporal Cognition publishes a controversial paper titled Entangled Resonance and the Persistence of Harmonic Memory. Its authors argue that acoustic energy especially from emotionally charged utterances can embed within environmental frequencies, reconstituting itself when sympathetic resonance occurs. In simple terms, sound, like memory, can remember who made it. They call it reciprocal consciousness encoding. Critics dismiss it as pseudo-acoustics, yet the timing is uncanny. Across the Atlantic, quantum theorists have begun exploring time-symmetric wave collapse where energy doesn't merely decay, but oscillates through causality itself. The Rowe cylinder becomes their favorite anomaly. A message, perhaps, not from the past, but across it, as the Smithsonian's analysis deepens. The story of the Rowe family re-emerges in public imagination. Media outlets revive the central mystery. The widow who recorded silence that spoke, the clock that stopped time. Descendants, long scattered, begin receiving calls from journalists and historians alike. One of them, Eleanor Rowe, great-great-granddaughter of Abigail Rowe, to participate in a controlled study. She visits the Smithsonian lab, where technicians play the enhanced file through precision speakers. When the whisper repeats, "Henry," Eleanor gasps. Her biometric readings, spike heart rate, galvanic skin response. "It feels," she says, "like recognition." No one can explain why. In the following months, the Rowe Foundation funds a public restoration of the family clock, now stored at the Virginia Museum of History. Conservators polish the brass, reset the pendulum, and document every creak and screw. The clock has not moved since 1999, its hands frozen at 12. But after recalibration, the mechanism begins to swing again, faintly hesitant, like an old lung relearning to breathe. That fall, as media coverage intensifies, the descendants organize a midnight vigil. October 17, 2020, exactly 122 years after the first reported reversal. The museum opens its rotunda to a small crowd of historians, sound engineers, and family members. The clock stands under soft amber light, its glass polished to a ghostly reflection. Microphones line the perimeter, connected to digital spectrograms. Outside, a storm gathers, the wind pressing against the museum's marble facade like something waiting to be let in. As the clock nears midnight, the room falls silent. Only the steady rhythm of the pendulum remains, echoing through the hall. Then 12. The chime rings once, twice, a third time, and beneath the hum of equipment, beneath the shuffle of feet, comes a sound. A faint, unmistakable whisper. Home. Air recorder captures it. Every microphone registers a consistent, localized source. Yet analysis afterward confirms the frequency didn't originate from any speaker or external device. It emanated from within the clock casing itself through solid brass. The crowd had heard it clearly. Some began to weep, others stared in silence. Eleanor stood nearest, hand trembling on the glass. For her, the word felt less like a voice and more like a recognition, a returning echo, completing a century's loop. In the days that followed, the data underwent scrutiny. Acoustic engineers separated every layer of ambient noise, confirming the impossible. The whisper's harmonic structure didn't match any known resonance of metal, air, or human throat. It existed at a frequency consistent with presonic vibration, as if sound had been encoded directly into the molecular lattice of the clock's frame. NASA's Acoustic Research Division performed their own independent review. Their conclusion: the emission is consistent with a pattern of low-energy quantum coupling. The source demonstrates characteristics of non-local coherence, suggesting the sound originates from both within and beyond the observed material boundary. In simpler terms, The clock might be echoing across dimensions of time, but for those who stood there that night, the explanation hardly mattered. It was not the science that moved them, it was the feeling that somewhere between loss and memory, between breath and silence, a woman's voice had reached through more than a century to find her way home. Eleanor later described the moment in a televised interview. It wasn't frightening. It felt patient, like someone who had been waiting for the world to finally listen. The Smithsonian digitization logs note a curious anomaly that night. During the exact second the whisper was captured, 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds every other recording, device within the 10-meter radius lost synchronization by precisely 1 minute. Not forward, not backward. Peril. When the data realigned, the time stop matched the one found in an 1873 telegraph log from Albemarle County, the night of the first reported anomaly. Researchers called it a coincidence. Archivists did not. Today, the Rowe clock remains on permanent display. The pendulum continues its slow, deliberate motion. Visitors lean close, expecting silence, yet sometimes swear they hear a faint murmur, cadence too soft to distinguish, but too precise to ignore. Security footage occasionally captures brief, mechanical hesitations at midnight, frames lost between ticks. And in the Smithsonian archives, the digital file labeled row_cylinder_final.wav contains one last spectral fragment. Only visible through sonographic imaging, its waveform, stretched across 3 seconds, forms a pattern resembling 2 interlocking shapes when forward, one mirrored meeting in perfect symmetry. Analysts call it a harmonic bridge. Historians call it evidence. But those who have listened long enough understand it differently. It is not a haunting. It is a return, a voice, patient as the swing of a pendulum, whispering nod to the living or the dead but to time itself. And somewhere, in the quiet tick between seconds, that voice still answers. It was a quiet evening in the archives of the Albemarle Historical Society, the kind of silence that seems to hum where every movement feels like trespassing. A graduate archivist, cataloging 19th century correspondences, pauses at a folder mislabeled undated domestic notes. Inside, among receipts, pressed flowers, and ink-stained letters lies a single loose page. The paper is brittle, browned at the edges, and the handwriting is unmistakable. Abigail Rowe's. The date, nearly faded, reads, October 17th, 1872. 12 hours before she was found lifeless in the parlor, beside the clock that would one day carry her name. The entry is not long, but it carries the weight of resignation. I know now that time keeps us, not the other way, she writes. I spoke his name not to call him, but to remember myself. If the clock must hold it, let it be mercy, not return. The ink trails downward at the end, as though her hand trembled mid-sentence. There are faint indentations beneath the final words marks, suggesting she wrote over another line, then pressed to erase it. The page is scanned and logged under artifact code AHSR1872. But the words once released into the modern system begin to echo far beyond the archive. Historians, linguists, even physicists dissect every phrase. To them, it becomes a riddle written by someone standing between two worlds, the mechanical and the emotional. Experts compare her phrasing with known letters. The loops of her H&T match verified samples. The ink composition dates precisely to the 1870s. There is no forgery, no tampering, only intent. But it is her intent that confounds them. Some interpret her mercy, not return as theological of final surrender. Others see it as mechanical awareness, a plea to stop the cycle that had bound her grief to rhythm. One researcher notices something subtle in the scanner, faint pressure mark at the top margin. Enhanced imaging reveals a partial fingerprint. Small, possibly female. When cross-referenced with existing family DNA logs from the 20th century, it aligns 74% with the Rowe line. That means the fingerprint, preserved in dust and time, may belong to Abigail herself. Her words begin to circulate online. Documentaries quote them. Psychologists claim they are evidence of anticipatory dissociation, a moment where consciousness fractures to protect itself. But others feel something quieter, as she was aware of the clock's strange inheritance long before science could describe it. In a filmed panel for the Virginia Museum of History, one scholar summarizes it with chilling simplicity. Abigail Rowe understood something we still struggle to name. That emotion can become architecture. The story shifts from investigation to meditation. What if her whisper, captured on a phonograph decades later, was not a haunting, but an imprint? A vibration preserved in metal the way fossils preserve motion. Theories diverge. The Journal of Temporal Cognition calls it acoustic trauma retention. The Journal of Psychohistory calls it the grief loop. For those who study our life, the discovery reframes every previous event. The parlor seance, the reversed pendulum, the synchronized whisper all seem to orbit this final page. It becomes the nucleus of meaning. Her last act wasn't supernatural defiance. It was documentation. A final note left for whoever would listen long after her heartbeat stopped. Within the Rowe family, the letter surfaced as old unease. Ellen Rowe, the linguist who once compared the clock's rhythm to her great-grandmother's recorded whisper, receives a facsimile copy. She reads it aloud under a dim reading lamp, her voice trembling at the phrase, "I spoke his name not to call him, but to remember myself." She later confides in an interview that those words made her question whether memory itself is an act of summoning. Outside academia, the public response grows mythic. People visit the museum not to see an antique, but to stand near an unresolved conversation. The clock, once a curiosity, becomes a mirror for their own losses. Visitors report feeling compelled to whisper the names of their departed when the second hand crosses 12. Staff call it the pause. Security footage shows people standing motionless, as though time itself bends inward for a breath. At 11:59 each night, the gallery lights dim automatically. The camera feed flickers in monochrome grain. The clock's brass surface reflects the ghostly outlines of visitors already gone. There is no sound, only the faint, mechanical hum of refrigeration in the next room. Then, as the final second turns, one sharp tick echoes through the hall. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but engineers confirm it shouldn't occur. The mechanism was disengaged for preservation years ago. The pendulum locked. Yet, on multiple nights, that same singular tick is recorded. Always at midnight. Always in October. Experts can't explain it, but those who've heard it say it feels less like movement and more like acknowledgement, a response. The debate over Abigail's final message reaches beyond folklore. Theological scholars argue it touches on the metaphysics of time itself, whether moments can hold memory, whether love, once declared, reverberates into structure. Physicists studying quantum entanglement cite her case in discussions of harmonic imprinting. They describe how particles once connected can mirror each other's state across impossible distances. Some suggest the clock's metal, shaped in her proximity and vibration, may have encoded her emotional frequency. The idea is dismissed by mainstream science, yet it lingers, uncomfortably poetic. Because the evidence isn't purely mechanical. It's emotional. The records of those who've heard the clock, the silence that seems to wait before the tick, the breath that tightens in the chest of anyone who listens closely enough. And so, Abigail's last entry becomes both confession and conclusion. It reframes the legend not as haunting but as continuity, a chain of listening passed through generations. Time keeping her, as she wrote, rather than the other way. Today, her letter sits beneath climate-controlled glass, its fibers illuminated by a soft halo of museum light. The ink has turned to a faint sepia bloom, but the words remain legible. Visitors lean in close, reading the last line as though it were written for them. If the clock must hold it, let it be mercy, not return. A child once asked a docent what that meant. The guide paused, looked at the clock behind her, and simply said, "It means she stopped asking for time to give back what it took." When the museum closes each night, custodians report the same phenomenon. As the lights fade and motion sensors arm, there is a hush, deep and absolute. The clock stands in the dark, unmoving, immaculate, and barely audible, like a breath drawn through wood. One solitary tick breaks the silence. No mechanism turns, no gears engage. Yet something that remembers continues to mark the living from the gone. Some say it's coincidence, others, resonance. But those who've listened long enough understand. It's neither. It's acknowledgement. A soft reminder that the boundary between sound and memory is thinner than we think. Some names, after all, are not spoken to, summon the dead. They're spoken to remind the living that time still listens.